we're back with another episode of One Free Family. This is James.
And Taylor.
And we're pumped to try something a little bit new today. Oftentimes we zoom in on one particular topic or answer one specific listener question or maybe do a mailbag. But you had an idea on a different format for today's show. So do you want to let people know what we'll be up to?
Sure. So yesterday, actually, we had a day where I think James and I, as parents, had some stuff that we had to work through, and there were some challenges that came up for us. And so I started thinking that it would be interesting to just have an episode where we kind of just talked about a fresh situation in our lives. I think a lot of times there's a lot of theoretical conversation around trying to parent more gently and give our kids autonomy, but sometimes it can be really helpful to just hear a story about what it looks like in real life, a real day for a real family. So that's what we're going to do. And we're going to talk a little bit about what went on during the day, some of the moments that were more challenging for us, how we worked through them, like the things that we did that we felt were good and the things that we wish we had done differently in hindsight, and reflect on that, and then talk a little bit about the lessons that we learned. And we just hope that it helps you to kind of see the real and authentic way that we sometimes work through things in our family. And I think it will be applicable to a lot of people and what goes on in your lives.
Yeah, because I think in some ways it's nice to listen in about one specific topic and think theoretically, but as we're actually in the saddle parenting every day, we rarely get to have all right, today is going to be the day where I work on conflict resolution, or today is the day I'm going to think about food.
Yeah.
It's actually all of these things just present themselves in a totally unpredictable fashion throughout our parenting days.
That's a good point, because there were kind of little nuggets about a few different things that came up during the day that challenged us in different ways.
Yeah, and so why don't I just jump in?
Do it.
With kind of how the day was proceeding.
That's it. No housekeeping, nothing today. We're just going to go for it.
There's that lady who, at the beginning who says... I don't know if you listen to the
I know
episodes,
her.
But
yeah. Our intro lady. She's great.
Right. onefreefamily.com/support.
Yeah, she's the best.
Become a patron of the show. Yeah, so that's all of our housekeeping to get out of the way. We could do a complaint of the week. I think I'm good, though.
No, we're good. Let's just go for it.
No complaint of the week this week. Okay, so why don't I start? So yesterday was one of those days where there shouldn't have been really there wasn't any major thing going on that you could point to and say, oh, well, we were having a hard time because of a death in the family.
This huge issue.
Yeah, there was nothing like that going on at all. But still, at around 2 p.m., I wound up in a very, very, very stressed out place. And I think it'd be helpful to kind of backtrack and just point out how a lot of little things can add up to a situation where being at your best parenting-wise can be pretty challenging. So day starts out pretty normal. I wake up, I take the dog out with 2 of our sons, and we're just having fun, chatting, doing whatever. Come back, and the house is full of kids, neighborhood kids. And so it's 8:30 in the morning, and this is all well and good. And this is not uncommon at our place.
Yeah, we typically love having them.
Yeah, our house is designed to be stuffed with neighborhood kids playing and climbing on things and playing video games and doing whatever else. So that was good. Things were working as intended. But it was a weird day because on Sundays during football season, I have to work from about 11 to 1, getting my main job's website all set up. It's a sports analytics website. So obviously football Sundays are a pretty big deal. And Taylor had actually booked a birth class. We've been double booked.
That was my bad. I booked it without remembering we were heading to football season, and not a birth class for myself to take. I'm not giving birth again soon. I was teaching it.
Congratulations on teaching a birth class.
Yes, thanks.
Yeah. And but it was all good. But nonetheless, mixing up the schedule a little bit. Sundays are already fairly intense since our website deals with sports. And I think that was a little bit of a contributing factor. It was a little bit unusual. And so I get home, Taylor kind of shuffles off to go teach her birth class, and I've got a house full of kids and preparing for work at 11. And for the first time, one of the other neighborhood kids was going to be watching our youngest.
Yeah, she was going to come out, hang out with him while James worked on his computer.
Right. So it was just I was just a little bit uneasy, right? And then we're in the house, and with all the neighborhood kids there, they want to figure out how it's going to work for them to take turns playing video games. And interestingly, if this was the only thing that happened throughout the day, I think I could have reflected on that they've all gotten actually much better at doing this.
Yeah, they do a pretty good job.
There wasn't a lot of yelling and screaming. There was people advocating for themselves, trying to stake out a position, trying to negotiate for what felt fair in their mind and bringing up different factors. But when you're hearing people, I can actually really empathize, I think, remembering back to when I was a kid and sometimes my parents, feeling a little bit stressed when there was a lot of that kind of energy in the house, because hearing people like negotiate really hard for things that they want, especially when it's your own kids, it does feel intense.
Yeah.
And you kind of have a little bit of skin in the game because it's your kids, and you want to make sure, like, our kids are also the 2 youngest among the neighborhood kids. So you want to make sure that they don't get ripped off or whatever. But if there was a visual graphic here, you would see like my little thermometer of stress, just like taking a few ticks up. Right. And we want to, I also am feeling in my head a little bit like, okay, well, I just have this work day coming up. You and I had talked like, hey, if it gets too stressful, we can always ask the kids to like do something else. But Sunday's really the only day. You know, one of our friends in the neighborhood, he's only around on the weekends. The other kids have school, of course. Yeah. And so they're really only available at length on the weekends too. And
our kids really value that time with their friends.
Tick up my thermometer of stress a little bit more, because in my mind, I'm like, I kind of feel like just taking space for myself here to just, you know, have some peace in the house while I get ready to work. And I want to be the best parent I can for my kids. And so kind of juggling that around in my mind as well. And, you know, ultimately the kids work things out. Our neighbor comes over to watch Gus while I settle in for work at 11. And much of the same thing continues. And by the way, the soundtrack to all of this is Gus, who's just like so vocal, so questioning, so like his mind is so active right now, but just nonstop chatter, mostly questions, and filled with demands of me as well.
So it's like the older kids negotiating hard to get their thing worked out. Were you helping with that at all, or were you kind of listening in?
I jumped in just a little bit when I felt like I was hearing them talk past each other and just saying like, hey, it sounds like we can all get our needs met.
Right.
He wants this, you want that. That actually, those things can coexist.
Right. So you're like listening to the intensity, you're offering support when you feel it's needed, and in the background you have a 2-year-old kind of like just saying the same things over and over again and needing you to do things for him. And like,
he repeats himself when he feels like he hasn't been heard.
For sure. No, I'm not blaming him, but it's just like a lot of layers of, for me, even like those layers of noise are quite a lot of input.
Sure. And I can often deal with that pretty well, but especially like kids wanting to be fed. Also, like I'm getting food for basically all the kids.
Yeah.
The youngest one wants whatever everyone else has. So we're just like, basically just in full on go mode. And then I settle in for work, and work feels kind of hard.
Sure.
And I'm still listening to all of that go on in the background. And now I'm adding on to that, talking on the phone with my business partner as we prepare for football Sunday. And so I only set the table here because this winds up becoming extremely relevant when you come home from your birth class, which I think you were feeling pretty good about.
Yeah, although I won't schedule it for that time again. I do feel badly about that.
Yeah, that's all good. But you come in, and at this point, I finish work, and now I come downstairs, and I'm like, gonna have some food, because I really haven't taken care of any of my own needs for most of the day. And another person comes in, and they ask to eat granola. And,
one of our kids.
Right. And I could tell it's like 1:30. And at this point, that kid I could tell he was kind of getting bored at the end of his rope with some of the video game stuff. He's the kid who probably likes the video games the least in our family.
At least the way that the other kids
right.
All
he
like
actually
to play
really,
them.
really likes them. But the way they were playing Fortnite, and it was highly competitive. And I could tell he was getting a little bit stressed out.
He has a shorter window for that kind of play.
He does. And he also is the one that is willing to forego his own other needs to keep pursuing this kind of stuff, because I think for him, it's a huge priority to maintain connection with the group. He has big time fear of missing out, FOMO.
Yeah, totally.
He doesn't want to get disconnected and have something epic happen that he wasn't a part of, right?
Yeah.
So he comes in, and with all of these little stressors built up over the day, again, nothing major, right? Like if I complained about any of those things individually, you'd be like, isn't that kind of parenting?
Yeah.
But he comes in, wants granola, and I respond, because I'm already not at my best. I'm hungry as well. And I respond, and I'm like, hey, should we really have granola again? Because like that's all you've eaten today. One little bowl of granola this morning. And I've noticed that doesn't, I think my first response was actually okay. And it was, I think I've noticed that when you only eat that you really can't be at your best. And we have so much more time ahead of us. Oh, also hanging over my head a little bit here is that one of these friends is sleeping over that night. And so, the kids are making plans on staying up late. And in the back of my mind, it's like, okay, so there's kind of no end in sight to this until tomorrow. And again, not bad, but like piling up.
Intense.
And knowing that he's probably planning on staying up late. So I do that. And then given that he's on low energy reserves from probably negotiating and not eating and working really hard at this video game, he snaps at me back pretty hard. And now I am kind of done at this point. Like, I've reached the end of the rope. I respond in what I think is a pretty loving way. That escalates the situation even further. Now he gets even more angry with me, and I point out, hey, I'm responding as lovingly as I can. And, it's really hard for me when I'm doing my best to get you your needs met to be like yelled at like that. And then you point out that actually I wasn't responding in a loving way at all. And then I was just sounding, I think you said that I was just trying to restrain my frustration.
Yeah.
And that was really hard to hear in the moment. And I think I at least took that and went outside to mow the lawn because that also needed to happen.
Don't make it sound like you stormed off. You didn't.
No, but I had a delayed storming off. I was making a plan to storm off later, which gave me a little bit of peace of mind. I exited the situation.
Sure, but I think
kind of kicked it to you, but that felt really hard.
But you exited the situation
that felt like failing, right?
Right, but when I gave you that feedback, you were like, then I think I just need a break. And I was like, totally. I think actually exiting wasn't the worst thing there. Taking some space from it.
Yeah, maybe. Ultimately it was a good idea, but in the moment, I just want to acknowledge that felt like failing.
Totally.
I felt like I was the one with them all morning. I didn't want to be saved by you swooping in and handling it. Sure. And it also, as I'm reflecting back on it, if we're in just real talk, this is our life. If we were talking off the air, I would point out that it helped me empathize with days where I've been off working for most of the day and you've been the one dealing with those little things piling up. And I have energy to be hey, who wants to go jump on the trampoline? Mm-hmm. And I think you've reflected to me before, that you don't want to have me come in and try to solve it when you're in the middle of it too. Sure. And I have had difficulty understanding that, I think, but this really shines a light on me for you were much clearly more capable. You were the substitute in that moment.
Well, I was just coming in with fresh energy.
But that's what I mean. Yeah. If this, to make a sports analogy, since I was on sports all day, the fresh legs there coming in at the end being hey, you weren't suggesting that I can't handle it, right? You weren't, it wasn't anything personal. It wasn't your lack of faith or belief in me as a parent. Totally. It was just that I wasn't handling it well and that you saw that you could handle it well. And, but it was still hard for me to acknowledge that. And so I go outside and I start mowing the lawn and then you take over.
Yeah. And then I do awesome for the rest of the day. Story over.
Sure. Well, let's zoom back or head on over to where you were at that moment, right? Because now you step into a situation that also has some of the little stressors for you, right?
Yeah. I think I step in and trying to kind of figure out if people need things and kind of where people are at. And I can tell that there's been some stress for James. And one of the things, so I think shortly after that, most of the kids decide to go outside and jump on the trampoline, except for this same child of ours who we feel hasn't really fed himself very well all day. He decides not to go because he's currently going through some big fears about getting stung by a bee because he's had a few bee stings lately. So he doesn't even want to go outside at all.
Can we talk about heartbreaking? He got stung in our bed.
Yeah, while he was falling asleep. He just randomly got stung by a bee in his bedroom.
And bees aren't a thing in our house. No. We don't have bees around our house.
No, it was so sad. So between that...
He said that I just want to say, because it was so sad, he said that he was always scared that a bee or a spider would get him in his sleep.
And now it happened.
Yeah, so I just want to say that. So yes, he's afraid.
Yeah, so he's also not wanting to go outside at all, which I feel pretty confident he'll move through. But anyway, all of these things. So I'm now my worry is starting to rise about him. And he's, for me, a lot been the one who I'm constantly trying to figure out, how do I be the best for him? I can't quite figure out what he needs all the time. He's a little harder to read. So I'm thinking oh, bummer, he's afraid to go outside. I think he's probably still just so low on nutrients because he's not really agreeing to eat much of nutritional value. And so I can feel my anxiety rising. So I check in with him about food. He doesn't really want to talk about it. So finally I do something that I feel was a good thing that I would suggest to other people, which is I just put together a couple snack type foods and just bring them to him where he's playing on his computer, almonds and carrots or whatever won't get super messy on the computer. He eats a little bit, but barely eats any. So then my anxiety rises even higher because I'm well, he's still not really eating and he's not playing with his friends and he just kind of seems a little bit down and low. And so I think from there I had that. I don't know if you've ever had that feeling. I'm sure as a parent you have. that feeling like in the pit of your stomach of just like something isn't right with one of my kids and I want to help them, but they're not really open to me helping them and I just don't know what to do. And I don't know about you, but when I go to that place, and it's actually been a while since I've really gone there. I used to go there a lot more frequently. But when I go to that place, I can sometimes spiral. And that's kind of what happened to me yesterday afternoon. I started worrying about all the things that could go wrong in the future and what aren't we doing for him? Are we doing enough? I hope he's okay in life in general. Like, it just really spiraled for me. So when James came inside, I basically dumped all that on him and just like kind of wondered aloud to him, like, would he do better in his life with more structure? You know, like all these like bigger picture questions that in the moment felt like they were attached to the situation at hand. But now that I'm out of it, I can see that I was basically just letting this challenging part of the day kind of spiral me into a place of like worrying about our whole parenting approach and all of these things, which, hopefully I'm not the only one who does that. I don't think I am. I think that happens to other people as well. So I kind of dumped that on James. And so now we're both just kind of feeling kind of bad again.
Well, yeah. And I think it really highlights how important it is to have self-awareness around your own triggers and your own, like,
the ways you respond to these things.
Well, yeah. And it's more like awareness around the parts of parenting that are the hardest for you, because those are the best times to call in someone to support you, right? And so, like, for me, one of my biggest difficulties is when I feel like there isn't peace in the house. That's a term I wind up going back to for whatever reason. And when I feel like there's a lot of disagreements or people getting angry with one another for whatever reason, like, that's the thing that will set me down that path of, like, feeling really frustrated or upset or having trouble coping, right? Mm-hmm. And for you, I feel like hearing you reflect that and living with you, parenting with you for 8+ years, one of the things is like when it feels like there's something going on with one of our kids that we can't solve in the moment. And with this kid in particular, you know, it's almost like this feeling, and I've heard it reflected both our Facebook group, which we would always love people to come say hi, and it's really been bumping recently. Yeah. The One Free Family Facebook group, still very, very kind, generous, uplifting place to be to discuss parenting. You know, I've noticed this a lot of times, like this tone of like, this thing happened in my life. I tried what I believe to be the best practices in parenting. Like you talked about how oftentimes like you do get the first response. I brought him the food. Right?
I offered to snuggle on the couch and read books with him. Like I tried to do the things that I felt were best.
Yeah, you've got like the beginning of your checklist. Yeah. And you start it. And then, but it can be hard when you get this feeling of like, well, that was supposed to work. That was like the thing I'm supposed to try next. And it didn't like instantly fix the situation or even seem to help at all, or they got even more mad and it was a total failure. And now it's like, oh, well, if that doesn't work, I don't know what to do because now I have this kid. And I think at that point, it is easy to backtrack and wonder. Mm-hmm. And, you know, part of our conversation yesterday was around, you know, our attitudes when things are really hard in our home. And again, this is a very common thing, I think, in households everywhere. It's easy to jump right into what did I do that was wrong that made it happen?
Right. Like my kid isn't at his, like, doesn't seem to be doing optimally well or whatever. And so it must be my fault. I could be doing something differently.
Yeah. And that I think is a really understandable instinct because in some ways it's empowering, right? It's saying, it's not giving up. It's not saying like...
Yeah, and it leads to intentionality, you know, like intentional decision making. And I think that's important.
Sure, but it can manifest as just beating ourselves up.
Exactly.
And beating ourselves up isn't actually productive.
It's almost like you have the thoughts of, could I be doing something differently? How could I have avoided this? And if you tried a whole bunch of things and you can't think of much else, like it's almost deciding at a certain point or at what point you can say, or my kid is just having a little bit of a rough spot right here and I'm going to be with him through it, even if I can't solve it.
Right. And I think the conversation around like, have we screwed our kid up with our parenting approach is not an uncommon one. It's probably one that many parents have. If they're ever thinking on that level, if they're thinking really intentionally about any approach, they probably have that. Some parents, I think, only have that conversation when they're really, really, really pushed. Whatever they're doing is completely failed and the kid is like in a total state of disarray. But I think it's not an uncommon discussion. The issue is that it's very difficult to make that a productive discussion in my experience because like for us, we could sit down and say like, hey, is this whole self-directed parenting or learning thing working out in our family? Like that could be And we have had discussions like that at various spots in the past. But whenever we really sit and we're in the right frame of mind, we go back and we rebuild it from the ground up. Like, do we believe this assumption still? Do we believe that? Do we believe these studies?
And overall, what have we seen in our kids as we've kind of used these ideas?
Yeah, let's reflect on how our kids are doing just generally. Are they kind, generous people?
Right, we go back to all the things we want most for them.
Yeah, are they... do they seem to be developing in terms of their critical thinking and their decision making? And every time we actually sit and think reasonably about it, we arrive to, actually our kids are doing great.
Yeah.
Our family is doing great in terms of how we love each other and treat each other. And let's stay on the same path. Right?
Yeah. So I think a big mistake, you're just making me realize right now, a big mistake that I make when I'm in kind of a place where I've spiraled into worry and fear is I have this instinct to sit down and have these like bigger picture conversations with James. Like, are we doing this right? What should we change? And it's pretty much never a good idea to be like having big picture conversations when I'm coming from a place of fear. Like, it doesn't accomplish anything. I don't want to make a decision coming from a place of fear anyway. So talking about it really doesn't even make sense. And I don't think that I can view it as like objectively and logically as I can when we're just kind of having a check-in, like, how is this working for our family?
Sure. Well, and I think it's tricky because on one hand, it's very reasonable to have concerns about how your kids are doing. And it's very reasonable to want to be heard and just to express this is really hard for me right now. Yeah, and I think it is. And you're right. It doesn't, like, if the discussion is just all about what's wrong, it's very hard to steer that back to, okay, well, we're still in this moment, regardless of whether we screwed up in the past.
Yeah.
So what can we do now in this moment to proceed? Because fear about the past rarely leads to the right frame of mind for executing on the best possible parenting for whatever the actual situation is.
Yeah, right? I mean, I think it's less fear about the past. It's more fear of if we keep parenting this way into the future, what will happen. So,
well, right, it's like fear that you messed up in the past is what I'm saying.
I guess so, but I think what you're trying to say is a good idea, which is like back off of like the big picture conversation and focus back in on the moment, right? Like, things don't feel right in this moment. Is there another next best step that we can take right now?
Yeah. And I think part of our hard conversation yesterday was I was trying to kind of steer it back to, you were like, well, what can we even do? And I was trying to steer it back to, well, I think what we should do is try to show as much love as possible, be as understanding and empathetic. And you were really struggling and you were like, well, we're like failing at that today. Mm-hmm. And I think that's another trap that we can fall into. And if you're feeling awkward, listener land out there, we've already worked through this. So we're
good.
We're not arguing about this now. But that's a trap that we can fall into, right? Which is like, just because if we know something is the right thing to do, the fact that we haven't always done the right thing kind of like doesn't matter.
It's kind of defeatist.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Just, it doesn't actually help the situation. It's like, well, duh, I know I just failed. Like,
right.
That's what I'm saying here. Like, I was trying. I didn't manage to succeed. But that doesn't mean I should stop trying that.
Right.
It doesn't mean I can't do it either, because oftentimes I can do it. It's just
sure.
that in that moment, given that little stage I set for you earlier, it was a more difficult situation to execute than normal. And I think this is another great reminder. If you're a listener of this podcast and you have trouble running out and like, you're like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. The next time this comes up, I'll handle it like I heard on One Free Family podcast. Understand that the hosts of the One Free Family podcast don't always parent like the people who talk on the One Free Parent or One Free Family podcast, because it's just really hard to, when you're actually in the trenches, execute on being the perfect parent you want to be.
Yeah, for sure.
And for me, it's much more about, maybe I've used this analogy on the podcast in the past, but it's one that really stuck with me. It was from an African spiritualist, and he was talking about how in the West, people conceive of God as this binary, like, where God is a farmhouse and there's a fence around the farmhouse, and you're either inside the fence, meaning like you're a Christian and you're like on the team, or you're outside of it and you're not on the team. And for him and his community and his culture where he grew up, he conceived of God and spirituality as a farmhouse as well, but one that you were either walking toward or walking away from or standing still, right? And the only really relevant thing you had control over was, were you moving closer to basically the ideal that you wanted in your life?
Right.
And so for me, you can set aside the religious analogy and just use it as the farmhouse being the parent that you want to be.
Right.
Like, you don't have to be am I the parent I want to be? Am I inside the fence? Have I achieved full parenting win? Or am I a total failure? And I think
right. It's not black and white. It's not a binary.
It's really hard, though. It feels
it's so hard. Right? Yeah, for
but
sure.
If instead I can say, I reacted very poorly around that food conversation, but walking towards the farmhouse looks like bouncing back from that, not just saying like,
that's that next best step.
Oh, shucks, I'm off the good parenting wagon now. I'm just going to like go be a bad parent now.
Yeah.
Because I'm a bad parent. Like, and it sounds silly when you're like talking about it rationally, but I think we've kind of all been there, right? It's like,
totally.
Like, I'm just going to set down this parenting book that I was reading. I'm going to set down these parenting ideas that I've been discussing with my partner because it's too hard. I can't
Clearly,
do it.
I can't do it.
Yeah,
right.
Because that's how I felt yesterday.
Yeah.
Until I was able to jump back out of it. And it was really hard, and I'm glad that I can wake up this morning, and I actually we'll get to the end of the day in a minute.
Yeah.
But that I can wake up this morning and still want to continue to progress. That's my benchmark. That's me measuring. Am I doing this right? I'm doing this right if I'm willing to keep trying to be better.
Yeah.
Like that's all that I can really only measure myself against my own baseline. So
yeah, sounds good. So we wanted to talk about the end of the day, and then I think we also need to talk about the other kind of piece of the thing that we were struggling with yesterday, which was the idea of like kids continuing to go back to something that's really intense and trying to figure out how to support them.
Yeah, let's start there.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so, the major thing we were worried about with the kid who I argued with the granola about was he didn't seem like he was having a great day. And he was still choosing to continue to pursue these things, and we're in the kitchen being like, what do we do when like he's obviously not enjoying this?
Right. Like, does he need more guidance away from it? How do we help him? He doesn't seem to be loving this, but he keeps going back to it. Like, what is our role is what we were trying to figure out.
Right. And the conversation around people being self-directed and out of control is one of using the term like addiction, let's say, right? Where people are like, oh, when somebody is like actively making a choice that they know they shouldn't be making, like that is when it's appropriate for someone else to intervene, right? Like you see this with grown-ups. People will stage an intervention and say like, hey, you're self-directing your own butt to 15 beers a day. Like we need to step in now and like help you to make a better choice in your life. And sometimes they'll even step in and intervene with, if it's like a certain kind of hard drug or whatever, people will intervene bodily and stop that person, right? And so as a parent, it can be tempting in those moments when we feel like our kid is going down a path that we believe is very obviously to their own detriment to step in, right? And I think sometimes that probably still would remain appropriate. Like there still probably would be times. And yesterday we were having this discussion, like, should we just say, all right, everyone's done for the day? Like,
yeah, everyone take a break.
Yeah, like we're all going to go and go out on a hike or, whatever. Like we were entertaining that sort of discussion, and it felt really hard. It felt really hard to know. And again, given that one of my main triggers is people disagreeing, and like when someone's doing something in a group and it doesn't feel like they're having fun, they are quicker to disagree. And, their triggers, it's funny too, because when you're an outsider, you can see, hey, you just dealt with this exact same situation in the game an hour ago, and it was fine. Like you dealt with it with total grace and whatever. And now an hour later, like you're flying off the handle. Right.
Like that's right. I look at that from the outside and I'm like, that is a clear sign that you need a break.
Right.
That's what I think. Yeah.
And all right, so we'll jump around a little bit here. As this child was reflecting later in the day on how the day went.
Well, I think we need to first finish talking about what we actually did, right? Like we didn't. Right. So we didn't say everyone shut it down, we're going for a hike, whatever. But we did at one point, and I don't think we ever officially made a decision to do that or not to do that, or even officially made any decision of like, okay, this is the plan. But what we ended up doing was at one point they all kind of were taking a break and we just kind of gathered everyone in the living room. We were like, hey guys, let's just talk about the plan for the rest of the night. And we threw out some ideas like, oh, the toddler wants to go out to the park. Do you guys all want to do that for a little bit? Would it be a good idea to take a break from the games for a little and play outside? Like we're going to order pizza later. Like we had like probably a 15-minute discussion with our kids and the kid who was sleeping over, where everybody, I actually think that in hindsight, I feel good about that. Like, I feel like everybody had a voice. Everybody got to make a choice that felt good for them. And not everybody made the choices that I would have made for them. But that's kind of the point. Like, they were able to choose for themselves and not feel kind of strong-armed into anything. Yeah,
that actually segues exactly into kind of where I was heading too, which is like, it's so hard to know like as a parent, we want to put ourselves in the shoes of our kids. And oftentimes like that's like the golden rule sort of idea, right? Like treat others as you would want to be treated. But in reality, one of the things I remember thinking when I was running camp was like, sometimes it helps to step past that and don't treat people how you would want to be treated, but instead try to figure out how they want to be treated.
Treat them how you think they want to be treated, right?
Yeah, using whatever information you have available to you at the time, right? And so in this case, people made decisions that weren't our own. And I think after the fact, or that we wouldn't have chosen for them, but after the fact, we could see, oh, right, like, they just have different priorities.
And
right?
they experience the world differently than us. Like, I was watching my kid go through this day thinking like, oh my gosh, if that were me, I would have checked out of that situation hours
ago. If you were forced to play the same video game for 6 hours.
Yeah, and we were arguing and all this stuff. Like, that is so not my idea of a good day, but that's only for me. And I find it seems so obvious. I so easily don't remember that. And I project my own preferences and my own experience of the world onto other people, especially on my kids, because I have a pretty good understanding of myself at this point in my life. I'm always still learning. So I think, okay, well, I know what makes me tick. I know what fulfills me. I know what's not worth it to me. And so I probably just should decide for them because I know thus what's best for them. And I forget, like, they're just completely different people than me. And I don't want them to be me. That would be super boring and also force them to change who they are.
Kind of creepy also. I don't know if I want a daughter who's identical to my wife. You know?
Or a son.
Or a son.
So I think that I'm even thinking out loud here, like that might be a mantra that I want to try to like add into my regular rotation of things that I try to tell myself in my head when I'm struggling. Like I've seen other people say this, like it's their path, it's not mine. And they're not going to make the same choice that I would make. And that is okay. And I can't guess how they're experiencing something. I have to ask them or watch them. And I also have to trust that sometimes, so this is kind of where we're going when you talk about how they felt at night, like that sometimes they're willing to work through challenges because the benefits are worth it to them, whereas for me, they wouldn't be.
Well, and I think it's really common. You see this in all different chapters of life, in all different types of relationships. But when we see a loved one struggling with something, our instinct is to want to make that struggle stop.
Yeah,
and
totally.
It's hard though, because most of growth comes from struggle. And if you see someone like, but there's like kind of like socially acceptable struggles, like, oh, she's struggling on her thesis to like get it done. You wouldn't be like, hey, maybe you should just stop writing your thesis.
Right.
Like this seems to be really stressing you out. Just give up.
Yeah.
You know?
Why do you keep going back to that thing that's making you so miserable?
Right.
Right.
And the person's like, well, cause like completing this thesis is important to me.
Yeah,
like,
it's going to be worth it.
Yeah, I wrote a 50-page paper to finish my senior year in college, and like it was really hard sometimes. And at the end, when I had that in my hands and I could like hand it to the professor, I felt a sense of accomplishment. And sometimes working through struggles looks like a socially acceptable thesis that everyone's going to applaud your diligence. And sometimes your struggle is, I'm in a group of people and like they're doing something that I'm not totally thrilled with, but like my main priority is to be a part of this group and be a part of this experience. And even if it's hard, I'm going to work through that because being involved in this is just so important to me. And like, I mean, I can remember being back in college again, probably that same week I wrote the thesis, I was at some party on the weekend being like, man, I'm really tired and it's really late and I don't want to miss out on the rest of this party. So I'm going to stay up and work through it. And that's not like a noble struggle necessarily, but it's like, that's just part of being a human.
You set your own goal and you were willing to work through certain discomforts to achieve it.
I don't need anyone else coming in and saying like, hey, James, like, why don't you go to bed now because you're at this party? No, I'm going to figure it out for myself. Like,
yeah. And I think another important piece that I would like to point out too for our kid is he wasn't, in some situations, I would be concerned about a kid sticking with it if they were kind of just stuck. You know what I mean? If they were stuck by outside factors. Like, he wasn't forced into that situation. He wasn't stuck. He had an out. He had both James and I at different times in the day offer to do something else with him, offer him alternatives. So he also knew that he had other choices and that he had a way out, and he was still making the choice to stay involved.
Yeah, that's definitely really important, that our struggles will feel more fulfilling when they're struggles we choose for ourselves.
Yeah. And for sure, there's going to be struggles we don't choose, and growth can happen from those too. But I think it was, like, in hindsight, again, more telling for me that even when he knew he had alternatives, he stuck with this. So it was that important to him.
Right. So fast forward now, and we're going to bed at nighttime, and we're like brushing our teeth, and our sleepover friend has gone off to the room he's going to sleep in. And, you know, the other kids are brushing their teeth and getting ready. And I'm kind of like still feeling like, I'm just feeling tired, man. I've been going now since 8 a.m. and it's like almost 11 p.m. because they're doing fun sleepovers, stay up late, hanging out, kind of things. And I say, so how was it today, guys? And instantly, both of them, the older boys, were like, it was amazing. It was incredible. It was the best day ever. And I'm like, it was? You know? And
I couldn't believe it when you told me that this morning.
I know. And they were like, yeah, it was so fun. And they just rattled off, like, we got 3 wins together today. That show was so fun. We watched like 11 episodes of it, you know? And they just like went off telling me stories about that day that I just experienced with them. But they snuggled right into bed with like utterly contented looks on their faces and like fell right asleep after like what to them felt like this epic journey of a day. And I was just sitting there like, oh my God, right. Like this was totally the day they chose for themselves. And especially for our youngest, who's like the youngest of the youngest.
You mean
our youngest in this group.
Right. Not our littlest child, but yeah.
He's sitting there and being like, this day had its ups and downs, and here I am, having stayed up as late as everybody else.
Yeah.
Got it. I didn't have to be left out of anything. I got to just stick with it for the whole day. And for like him, that felt like pure satisfaction. Like the goal had been completely met. I should add too that then all these same kids who just spent 14 hours together painstakingly worked through the arrangement on, if somebody wakes up first, if it's 6:15, come wake me up. If it's 6 a.m.,
right,
don't
to make
bother,
sure they didn't miss out on morning playtime before he had to leave.
At 8:30, yeah. And so, but I don't know, it was like really crazy to be like, we all were in the same house for the same day.
Right.
All 5 of us in our family having totally different experiences of basically the same stimuli. And any worries we had about like, is he in a big place of struggle?
Right.
Is he not? Like, no, for him, it was more like if you see your friend running by on a marathon.
It was epic.
Like,
yeah.
Yeah. You're like, oh, is Mike really struggling right now? Like his face didn't look so well. It's like, yeah, he's running a marathon. Like it feels hard, but no one made him. It's not the Hunger Games. Like he's choosing this. I don't know. Like we had some ups and downs and like it felt hard as all heck sometimes. But we argued with each other.
Just like more support for the idea of like every person in the world experiences the same situation so differently. And it's so easy to forget that. But them saying at the end of the day how awesome their day was, me feeling like the day was just so hard. I think we talked last week or the week before about how the moments that are happy for your kids, it's like try not to spend them being miserable yourself.
Yeah.
And I mean, partly to be sure, like I wasn't sure my one kid was really happy, but my hope when you're talking about walking towards that farmhouse, right, towards that parent I want to be, my hope is that I can move further and further towards trusting the choices that they make.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think trying to measure ourselves, I once heard trying to measure how well you're parenting by your kid's happiness can be really tricky because
I've talked about that with a friend actually too.
It's really difficult to measure someone else's happiness. It's like, it's the problem with self-reporting. Like they're going to show you what they're going to show you. They're going to be working on things internally. No one is going to be an open book to us.
Right.
Even our own kids, no matter how much we love them and how kind and generous and whatever we are. We're not entitled to that either, by the way.
Yeah.
We're not entitled to our kids being an open book to us.
So true.
And when we can have the perspective that we're partners in this and that the major thing that we can control is what we do, our words, our actions, then it puts us in the position to, because like if you hadn't stepped in and pulled me away from that not so great conversation I was having in the middle of the day, maybe I don't even get to hear that it was an incredible day at the end of the night, right? Like
if you hadn't been able to hear that.
Well, right. I pat myself on the back for being able to hear criticism. But yeah, like that is not something, like if we're measuring our own parenting, are we walking towards the farmhouse? That isn't feedback I would have been open to 2 years ago for sure. Maybe not a year ago, maybe not 6 months ago. In the moment, like I'm not sure if I could have walked away from or been able to hear like, hey, just so you know, you're not being the parent you want to be right now.
Right.
And for me, that feels like a good heavy foot in front of the last foot. Like,
yeah. And you talked about, not always measuring our parenting success by like how we perceive our kids' happiness to be. I think there's also something to be said there for not holding ourselves responsible for our kids always being happy. Like we can put one foot in front of the other, walk towards that parent that we want to be. We're not always going to make the right choice, and we're just going to keep trying. And where I was yesterday thinking about like, are we doing the right things for him? Have we set up the right life for him? Like all of these huge questions. We can't always guess exactly what our kids need. It's just not possible. So we just keep taking in new information and we keep trying to make the best choice that we can, and ultimately remember that they are just completely different people than us. And we just can't shoulder that. It's a burden to shoulder the, like, my kid needs to be happy all the time and I have to make that happen.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one final little distinction before we get going, we can't always be responsible for our kids' happiness, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. And like, I say that because I think that same kind of rhetoric is often used when parents are intentionally putting their kids through trials and tribulations.
Yeah, I wouldn't advocate for that,
right,
for
where
sure.
They're saying like, oh, I'm going to put my kid through this really hard thing because like it's not my job for them to be happy.
Oh yeah, no, that's not what I mean. Because
No,
life definitely presents enough authentic, organic challenges. We don't have to.
Right, I think that's actually the better reflection
Yeah.
is to say like, even in this life where we are working our absolute hardest to connect our kids with their needs and desires and so forth, that like life can still be plenty hard. They can still get their butts kicked sometimes by life and have these challenges. And we don't want to measure how well we're parenting by the absence of challenges and difficulties in our kids' lives. Maybe a better way to put it.
That's a good way, yeah.
But we can still set the goal of how can I create an environment that I believe, based on my own evidence and research, whatever, experiences that will help them to move towards a life of happiness.
Yeah, and then how can we partner with them through the hard times?
Yeah, that's it. Cool. We did it.
So
All right.
thanks so much for joining us on your parenting journey, and especially pertinent to this episode, I think. Just keep in mind that each moment is another opportunity to be the parent that you want to be.
Yeah, and I'm feeling even more love for you guys than usual because we've given you a window into our lives, and you've seen that sometimes we can feel like good parents and sometimes we can feel like bad parents too.
Yeah,
so,
it was real today.
Yeah, I do love you guys, and we will see you in the Facebook group and see you next time.